The desert called to Mescal, and she wondered about the white prophet's vision. But Eshta believed that white blood and red blood would not mix. He thought that the Indian's blood paled in the white man's stream, or burned red for the sun, waste, and wild. Eshta's forefathers had called the desert flower to take root in the soil of her ancestors. But Mescal's white friend had smelted her and brought her up as his own. He wanted to take her home, to love her better and trust in the future. The white man's ways were different, and Eshta understood. He had even given his granddaughter to his friend, who named her after the flower that blows in the wind of silent places. Mescal had been the bond between them, but now she was gone, and the white father sought the Navajo. Eshta rallied a band of young braves, guided by warriors who knew every trail, waterhole, and cranny. They searched the plateau, working westward, scouring the levels, ridges, and valleys. They climbed peaks and sent their Indian dogs into thickets and caves. They found only a few hogans hidden under yellow walls or amid clumps of cedars. Mescal was torn between two worlds, but the search for her went on. The chiefs sternly questioned every Indian they encountered, searching their dwellings and examining the ground around their water holes. Mile after mile, the plateau was covered by these Indians, with a hunting instinct that left scarcely a rabbit burrow undiscovered. The days flew by, the sun arched higher, and patches of snow disappeared from high places as the search proceeded westward. They camped wherever night overtook them, sometimes near water and grass, sometimes in bare, dry places. To the west, the plateau widened, with rugged ridges rising here and there and seared crags splitting the sky like sharp saw-teeth. After many miles of wild upranging, they reached a divide that marked the line of Eshta's domain. Justice's dogged persistence and the Navajo's faithfulness carried them into the country of the Moki Indians, a tribe classified as slaves by the proud race of Eshta. They searched the villages, ancient tombs, and ruins, but of Mescal there was never a trace. Langford rode diligently and searched indefatigably as August did, but he never had any real hope of finding the girl. To hunt for her, however, despite its hopelessness, was a melancholy satisfaction, for she was never out of his mind. The month's hard riding with the Navajos was not without profit. Langford made friends with the Indians and learned to speak many of their words. Then a whole host of desert tricks became part of his accumulating knowledge. In climbing the crags, looking for water and grass, loosing Silvermane at night and searching for him at dawn and marking tracks on hard ground, he learned much from the Navajos. The whole outward life of the Indian was concerned with the material aspect of nature: dust, rock, air, wind, smoke, the cedars, and the beasts of the desert. These things made up the Indian's day. The Navajos worshipped the physical world, with the sun being their supreme god. At dawn, when the sky turned from gray to rosy red, they would begin their chant to the sun. Come sunset, the Navajos would stand watchful and silent, faces pointed towards the west. Langford noticed that the Moki Indians also had their morning service to the great giver of light. In the early dawn, before the pink hues appeared in the east and everything was still gray and dark, the Moki people would come out of their small mud and stone huts and sit on their roofs with their heads lowered and covered in blankets. One day, August Justice revealed how significant the sun was in the lives of desert men. "We need to turn back," he told Langford. "The sun is getting hot and the snow will melt in the mountains. If the Colorado River rises too high, we won't be able to cross." It took them 2 days to ride back to the encampment, where Eshta received them in dignified silence, expressing his regret. When it was time for them to leave, Eshta accompanied them to the head of the nearest trail, which started down from Sweep Peak, the highest point of Echo Cliffs. It was the Navajo's outlook over the painted desert. "Mescal is there," August Justice said. "She's there with the slave Eshta gave her. He leads Mescal. Who can follow him there?" The old chieftain reined in his horse beside the time-hollowed trail, and the same hand that waved his white friend downward swept up in a slow, stately gesture toward the illimitable expanse. It was a warrior's salute to an unconquered world. Langford saw in his falcon eyes the still gleam, the brooding fire, the mystical passion that haunted the eyes of Mescal. The slave without a tongue is a wolf. He sensed the trails and the waters. Eshta's eyes have grown old watching here, but he has seen no Indian who could follow Mescal's slave. Eshta will lie there, but no Indian will know the path to the place of his sleep. The trail of mescal was nowhere to be found in the sandy terrain. Eshta's words held great wisdom, and he pointed out the futility of searching for any living beings in this vast and borderless land of shifting clouds of sand, purple curtains that shrouded mesas and domes, and colored dunes that resembled a rainbow realm of the sun. Langford was initially captivated by the beauty of the landscape, the copper belt that lay close to the cliffs, the white beds of alkali and washes of silt that stretched farther out, the wind-plowed canyons and the dust-encumbered ridges that ranged from the west to the east. He also observed the scalloped slopes of the flat tableland that rose low and the tips of volcanic peaks that led the eye beyond to veils and vapors hovering over blue clefts and dim lines of level lanes. As he gazed out further, Langford realized that he was looking at a world governed and painted by the sun, a deep and majestic nature that was eternal and unchanging. However, it was only through Eshta's eyes that Langford could see the devastating reality of the parched slopes, the terrifying desolateness, and the sleeping death of the land. When the old chieftain spoke, Langford braced himself for the austere speech and the pain that it would bring him. Eshta revealed that the white prophet's child of red blood was lost to him, and that the flower of the desert was like a grain of drifting sand. Chapter 13. August Nabb was hopeful that mescal had returned while he was away, but Langford knew that such hope was in vain. As they arrived at the oasis, they were met with solemn faces from the women, indicating that bad news was to come. Reluctantly, they shared the news that mescal's flight had been forgotten due to a more pressing and tragic event. Snap Justice's wife was gravely ill, a victim of her husband's drunken rage. In the days following August and Jack's departure, Snap Justice had been in a stupor, but as his alcohol supply dwindled, he emerged from his almost comatose state into a state of frenzied insanity. He had attempted to murder his wife and destroy his home, but Dave Justice intervened just in time. The other brothers were too afraid to confront him. After the incident, the man fled on the White Sage Trail and was never heard from again. August Justice, a Mormon, did everything in his power to save his son's wife, but he was unsure if she would survive. Nevertheless, he remained patient, kind, and optimistic. August urged Langford to rest before heading out to tell his sons that he would join them later. Leaving the oasis was a relief for Langford, who arrived at Silver Cup that night. As he approached the campfire, he searched for Snap Justice's face, but none of the 4 men present matched Snap's description. Dave Justice greeted Langford and asked about his father and mescal. Langford recounted his fruitless search for Snap, to which Dave responded that Snap was impossible to track and that mescal was likely to die or become a cactus. Dave had no significant news to share except that the cattle had survived the winter and that he and Zeke had pursued Whitefoot, ending up near Seeping Springs. We ran into Joe Stube, a rider who used to be friends with Zeke. He's now working for Holderness, and he informed us that Holderness had rebuilt the corrals at the spring and constructed a large cabin. He also has a dozen riders working for him. Stube told us that Snap had been causing trouble in White Sage and had killed Snood in a disagreement about me. Apparently, Snood took my side in an argument with Snap, which led to his demise. Dave expressed concern over Snap's actions, stating that he was going too far. The Mormons in White Sage have outlawed Culver, and Snap will be next. Dave warned me to be careful, as Snap may come after me someday. On the 3rd day after Dave's warning, Langford spotted Snap and another man riding towards Silver Cup. The other man was tall and rode a big bay horse. Dave had already seen them and had gone down to the edge of the cedars. When he returned, he informed us that Snap was with Holderness and asked what I planned to do. I had no answer, as I didn't know what to do in this situation. "I ain't gonna run off from camp just 'cause some men don't like me," Dave declared. "It might be the smartest move," Langford countered. "You want me to run away 'cause of your brother?" Dave asked. "No," Langford replied. "But would you draw on him?" "Of course not. He's August Justice's son and your brother," Dave replied. "Yeah, and you're my friend, which Snap won't think about. Will you draw on Holderness then?" "I can't say for sure, Dave," Langford replied, pacing the trail. "I need something to snap in me before I can kill a man. I'd draw if it was self-defense, but what good would it do me if I drew too late? This is what I've been worried about. I'm not scared of Snap or Holderness, not that way. I mean, I'm not ready. Would either of them shoot an unarmed man? I hope not, but you're carrying your gun, Dave pointed out. Langford unbuckled his cartridge belt, which held his Colt, and hung it over the pommel of his saddle. He then sat down on one of the stone seats near the campfire. Here they come, Zeke whispered, rising to his feet, followed by George. Easy, fellas, Dave warned. I'll do the talking. Holderness and Snap emerged from the cedars and trotted into the glade, reining in their mounts a few paces from the fire. Dave stood directly before Langford, and George and Zeke stepped aside. Howdy, boys. Holderness greeted them with a smile that was like a gleam of light playing on a frozen lake. His amber eyes were steady, their gaze contracted into piercing yellow points. Dave studied the cattleman with cool scorn, but refusing to speak to him, addressed his brother. Snap, what do you mean by riding in here with this fellow? I'm Holderness's new foreman. We're just looking round, Snap replied. The man's face had turned hard, his eyes filled with a cruel intensity. New foreman? Dave exclaimed, his jaw dropping in disbelief. You can't be serious, you must be drunk, he continued. That's what I said, growled the man known as Snap. You're a liar, Dave shouted, his cheeks turning crimson with anger. It's true, Justice, he's my new foreman, Holderness interjected smoothly. And I'm willing to pay him $100 a month in gold. I could offer you a good spot, too, he added. Dave's arms fell limply to his sides, and his face turned white as a sheet. Holderness, he exclaimed. I know what you're thinking, but it's not worth it. You're going against your own father, your brothers, your own flesh and blood, he said to Snap. I can't see it that way, Snap replied sullenly, shifting in his saddle. You're a drunken, easily led fool, Dave retorted. This man's no rancher, he's a rustler. He ruined Jacob Severino, the father of your first wife. He's stolen our cattle, he's jumped our water rights. He's trying to break us. For God's sake, ain't you a man? Things have gone bad for me, Snap replied, his tone defensive. I reckon I'll do better to cut out a loan for myself. You crooked cur, Dave exclaimed, his tone filled with disgust. But you're only my half-brother after all. I always knew you'd come to something bad, but I never thought you'd disgrace the justices and break your father's heart. Now then, what do you want here? Be quick. This is our range, and you and your boss can't ride here. You can't even water your horses. Spit it out, Langford exclaimed. He had been so engrossed in the conversation that he momentarily forgot himself. Suddenly a chill ran down his spine, and his chest tightened. Snap's eyes darted around, and in an instant Langford heard a loud bang and saw a flash of red. Instinctively he dodged, but a searing pain replaced the light impact of what felt like a puff of air. He slumped down against a stone, clutching his bloody chest. Dave sprang into action, knocking Snap's Colt out of his hand and holding him in a vice-like grip. George Justice kicked Holderness's horse, causing the rider to nearly lose his balance. Zeke rushed over to Langford and propped him up against the stone. Calm down, Zeke commanded. He's a goner. My God, Dave cried out, his voice breaking. He's not dead, is he? Shot straight through the heart, Dave said, hurling Snap backward, almost off his horse. You dirty scoundrel, run or I'll kill you. And you, Holderness, remember this, if we ever cross paths again, you draw. He grabbed a branch from a cedar tree and slashed both horses, causing them to bolt out of the glade and disappear into the distance. Dave stumbled blindly back toward his brothers. Zeke, this is terrible. Snap has committed another murder, and he killed my friend. Who's going to tell Father? Suddenly Langford sat up, his shirt open and his bare shoulder stained with blood. His face was pale, but his eyes were smiling. Cheer up, Dave, I'm not dead yet. He's right, Zeke interjected. He dodged just in the nick of time and took the bullet in his shoulder. Dave sat down quietly without saying a word. The hand he placed on Langford's knee trembled slightly. Zeke spoke up, his voice tense. I saw George make a move for his gun, and I knew things were about to get ugly. So I told them Jack was dead. Langford looked worried. Do you think they came for me? Without a doubt, replied Dave, wiping sweat from his forehead. I knew it from the beginning, but I was thrown off by Snap going over to Holderness. I didn't realize he was edging closer until it was too late. Zeke interrupted. Listen, I hear horses. He paused, listening intently. It's Billy coming from the home trail, George added, and Father is with him. Do we have to tell him about Snap? Dave sighed. Someone has to, and that someone will be you, George. You're always the one doing the talking. August Justice rode into the clearing and dismounted. "I heard a gunshot. What's going on? Who's hurt?" He turned to Langford. "Son, how are you feeling?" "Not too bad," Langford replied. "Let me show you my wound." August pushed Zeke aside. "It's just a flesh wound, not serious. We'll take care of it tomorrow. Now, who was here?" "Snap came and left his respects," Langford said. "Already?" August shook his head. "I knew it was coming. You're lucky, Langford, that it wasn't worse. Did Snap surprise you?" "No," Langford said. "I knew he was coming." Dave spoke up. "Jack hung his belt and gun on Silvermane's saddle. He didn't want to fight either Snap or Holderness." "Holderness?" August's voice was sharp. "Yes," Dave continued. "Snap rode in with Holderness. Langford thought if he was unarmed they wouldn't draw, but Snap did." "Was he drunk?" August asked. "No," Dave replied. "They came over to kill Langford." He recounted the entire incident, then added, "And Dad, that's not all. Snap's gone to the bad." Dave covered his face while the others turned away. Langford closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the events of the day. The room was silent, save for the heavy footsteps of the old man pacing back and forth. Langford slowly opened his eyes to see Justice standing tall and rigid with his arms raised. After a moment, August spoke. "Langford, I take responsibility for this cowardly attack on you. This is the second time. Beware of the third. Do you remember when I told you that you must face Snap man to man?" Langford nodded. "Don't you want to live?" August asked. "Of course," Langford replied, confused. "Then why did you let yourself be shot down in cold blood? Why did you hang up your gun? Why didn't you draw on Snap?" August demanded. Langford hesitated before answering slowly. "I didn't know before what I know now. My flesh sickened at the thought of killing a man, even to save my own life and to kill your son." "No son of mine," Justice interrupted. "Remember that when next you meet. I don't want your blood on my hands. Don't stand to be killed like a sheep. If you have felt duty to me, I release you." Zeke finished bandaging Langford's wound and lifted him into a bed of blankets, cautioning him to lie still. Langford felt an overwhelming tiredness that filled his bones. He drifted in and out of consciousness, hearing the wind, Silvermane's bell, and the murmur of voices. But it all seemed distant and unimportant, like a dream. The next day he rode home feeling weak and tired, slumping in the saddle and relying on August Justice's strong arm to keep him upright. They arrived at their destination, and his wound was tended to before he was put to bed. He slept for most of the next 3 weeks, with occasional moments of contemplation. Throughout his recovery, he realized that he had come to a crossroads. He could either back away from the harsh realities of the desert and admit defeat, or he could venture further into its depths. The decision weighed heavily on him, but he knew that he would have to make it soon. He began taking solitary rides more frequently, always on the lookout like his horse, Silvermane. His duties took him far and wide, from Seeping Springs to the Red Wall, up the Coconina Slope and into the forest of towering pines. His senses were always alert, and he noticed every wild creature that crossed his path. The seasons changed, and the days flew by. Spring gave way to summer, and the scorching heat was replaced by a cool mountain breeze. October brought snow flurries, and November brought dark storm clouds. Langford was the last rider to leave the mountain, and the brothers were waiting for him at Silver Cup. August Justice was surprised by the details of the range riding since his absence. Holderness and Snap had kept their distance after the supposed murder of Langford. Though they occasionally rode near Dave and his followers, there was never a confrontation. Throughout the summer and fall, not a single steer had been taken from the range. Langford had managed to avoid any major incidents except for the constant threat looming over Seeping Springs. Despite this, the months had flown by for him, even though they seemed like years when he looked back on them later. During the winter at the oasis, Langford kept himself busy with various tasks. He spent time watching the children play in the yard, relaxing with Silvermane in the sunshine, and taking on any work that presented itself. However, it was during the long evenings when time seemed to drag on, and memories of the past began to weigh heavily on him. Whenever he caught a glimpse of the red sunset through the cliff gate in the west, Langford's thoughts would wander. He had a complicated relationship with the painted desert, both loving and hating it at the same time. He couldn't help but think of Mescal, who he imagined was still in the area, hidden away in the purple shadows. Whenever he sat by the log fire, he would dream of her riding on Black Topper, with her hair streaming freely in the wind. But he couldn't shake the image of her sitting in the corner of the room, silent and still, while the man she had promised herself to hovered over her. That memory was like a painful wound, constantly throbbing and reminding him of his troubles. It was like a spark that had been dropped onto his already scarred heart, causing it to flare up with pain. It was like a beacon, shining a light on the dark path he knew he would have to cross sooner or later. Chapter 14. It was the anniversary of the night Mescal vanished when the eerie voice that had been calling out to Langford frequently and in a strange manner awakened him from his slumber once more. He sat up in his bed, shuddering and listening intently. The room was pitch dark and completely silent. Langford lay back down, trembling with emotions. Sleep eluded him for the rest of the night, and he lay there, waiting for the dawn, feeling feverish. As soon as the gray light of dawn broke in, Langford knew what he had to do. He got up, and after having breakfast, he went to seek out August Justice. "Can I cross the river?" Langford asked the old man, interrupting his carpentry work. The old man looked up at Langford and then turned his gaze towards the desert. "Mescal?" he asked. "Yes," replied Langford. The old man shook his head and spread his hands. "There's no point in me telling you what the desert is like. If you ever come back, you'll bring her. Yes, you can go. It's a man's mission. God be with you." Langford spoke to no one else. He packed one saddlebag with grain and the other with meat, bread, and dried fruit. He strapped a 5-gallon leather water sack behind Silvermane's saddle and set out towards the river. At the crossing, he removed Silvermane's gear and placed it in the boat. Suddenly he heard a long howl that sounded like a dog baying at the moon. Langford looked around and saw an animal on the sandbar. At first he thought it was a gray timber wolf, but he noticed that it was too white. "It might be a Navajo dog," he muttered. The animal sat down on its haunches and lifted its head to howl. It trotted along the sandbar, occasionally stepping to the water's edge. When it saw Langford, it began to bark furiously. "It's definitely a dog," Langford said. "Where have I seen him before?" Suddenly he jumped to his feet, almost tipping the boat over. "He looks like Mescal's wolf," he exclaimed. He looked closer and then shouted, "Ki-yi! Wolf! Come here, boy!" The dog leaped into the air and began to run back and forth along the sand, yelping loudly. "It's Wolf! Mescal must be nearby!" Langford cried out. His vision became blurry and his heart was beating loudly. "Wolf! Wolf! I'm coming!" With trembling hands, he tied Silvermane's bridle to the stern seat of the boat and pushed off. Langford rowed with eagerness, but his excitement caused him to drag Silvermane's nose under the water. He had to check himself and call out to the dog repeatedly. Finally, the boat's bow scraped against the sand, and Silvermane emerged with a splash and a snort. Langford cried out to Wolf, "Where's Mescal? Wolf, old fellow, where is she?" He hugged the dog as it whined and licked his face before running up the sandy trail and back again. Wolf barked no more, but waited to see if Langford would follow. "All right, Wolf coming," Langford said. He saddled Silvermane quickly and mounted the horse with haste. He followed Wolf into the willow-skirted trail, up the rocky bench and under the bulging wall. Wolf led Langford to the level between the canyon and Echo Cliffs before heading straight west toward the Painted Desert. The dog trotted a few rods and turned to see if Langford was coming. Doubt and fear ceased for Langford as he breathed in the dust-scented air. He knew Wolf was leading him to Mescal. The cry he had heard in his dream was hers, and the old mysterious promise of the desert had begun its fulfillment. Langford's soul sang within him as he saw the horizon, the treeless plains, the sun-scorched slopes, the sandy stretches, and the massed blocks of black mesas. For Mescal was there, far away, a mere grain of sand in all that world of drifting sands. She might be hurt or ill, but she was alive, waiting for him, calling for him, crying out with a voice that no distance could silence. Langford did not see the sharp peaks as pitiless barriers, nor the mesas and domes as black-faced death, nor the moisture-draining sands as life-sucking foes to plant and beast and man. That painted wonderland had sheltered Mescal for a year. The desert had always held a special place in Langford's heart. He loved it for its ever-changing colors, its mysteriousness, and its ability to hide secrets. But now he loved it even more because it had been a home for mescal. He chuckled at the deceptive yellow and purple hues in the distance, knowing they were nothing more than a mirage. The wind carried a sweet melody that filled his ears, while the dry desert scents were like a pleasant fragrance to his nose. The sand felt like sugar between his teeth, and the shimmering heat waves created a beautiful haze that framed the desert in a picturesque view. Wolf, Langford's faithful companion, led the way for about 30 paces before he stopped and looked back to ensure his master and his horse were following. Langford had noticed the dog earlier, but had been too preoccupied with the vast expanse of the desert and the sky to pay him much attention. The occasional appearance of wildlife caught his eye, like a coyote sneaking into the cactus, a horned toad resting in the dust, or a jewel-eyed lizard basking in the sun. It wasn't until Langford's mind had settled that he finally took a closer look at Wolf. The dog's coat was the same color as a real wolf, and he was limping on his right front paw. Langford dismounted and called the dog over to him, but Wolf didn't come with his usual eagerness. His eyes were sad and unfamiliar. Langford felt a sudden sense of foreboding, but he pushed it aside with all his might. Still, a chill ran down his spine. Examining Wolf's paw, he saw that the ball of his foot had been worn through. Langford quickly fashioned a makeshift moccasin out of buckskin and tied it around the dog's foot. The wolf licked his hand, but sadness still lingered in his eyes. He looked towards the west, eager to be on his way. "All right, my friend," Langford said. "Let's take it slow. Your foot looks like it's been on a long journey." They turned towards the west, with the dog leading the way and Langford following closely behind. As they climbed up the hill, Langford realized that he had only been through a small part of the journey. The real journey was just beginning, and the painted desert lay ahead of them. The desert was vast and seemed to reach up to the sky with 1,000 lines, ridges, and canyons all ascending out of a deep purple gulf. The desert embraced them, and Langford felt a chill beneath its warmth. As they descended into the valley, Langford followed Wolf's lead and kept a straight course in line with a volcanic spur. He was amazed by the dog's ability to navigate through the rocky terrain, crossing deep washes and going around obstructions. Wolf always veered back to their original course, as true as a compass needle to its magnet. The air grew warmer and closer as they continued their descent, and by mid-afternoon Langford was drenched in sweat. Silvermane, his horse, was also wet with perspiration. Looking back, Langford felt a sense of loss as the sweeping line of echo cliffs had disappeared behind the horizon, leaving no familiar landmarks behind. As the sun began to set, Langford realized that it was time to make camp. He found a stone that would serve as a windbreak, and he laid his saddle for a pillow and his blanket for a bed. He gave Silvermane a nose-bag full of water and then one of grain. He fed the dog and then attended to his own needs. The sudden gathering of brilliant crimsons, splashed with gold, signaled the end of the day, and Langford settled in for the night, ready to continue their journey in the morning. As he finished his work, the blazing desert sun had given way to a cool, gray evening. Night was approaching fast, and he quickly made a little hollow in the sand to rest his hips. He took a final glance at his horse, Silvermane, who was tied to a nearby rock, and called for his faithful dog, Wolf, to come lay by his side. It was a routine he was used to, sleeping under the open sky with the wind blowing and sand seeping in. But tonight was different. He was in the painted desert, with Wolf by his side and mescal somewhere beneath the blue-white stars. He woke up before dawn, as was his habit, and started feeding his loyal companions. The sky was beginning to turn a soft shade of pink, and the air was crisp and clear. He tried to cheer Wolf up, but the dog seemed sad and forlorn. Langford couldn't help but feel excited about the day ahead, even though he had calmed down from his initial exuberance. He mounted his horse and, with a ring in his voice, called out to Wolf to lead the way. Suddenly the sun burst out from the east, and the gray curtain of night was lifted by a magnificent display of pink, white, and gold. The colors trailed westward, creating a breathtaking sight. As they started moving, Langford realized that Wolf wasn't tracking a back trail, but was instead traveling by instinct. They encountered draws that required a search for a crossing, areas of broken rock that had to be rounded, steep flat mesas rising in their path, strips of deep sand, and canyons that were impossible to cross for long distances. But Wolf always managed to find a way, always coming back to the black spur that Langford had marked. It stood out in sharp relief no closer than before, and Langford began to doubt its reliability. The ragged blue mass of the Ghost Mountains suddenly vanished before Langford's eyes. He had seen them before, but never so distinctly. The purple tips, the bold rock ribs, and the shadowed canyons were all so sharp and clear in the morning light. It was hard to believe that these were only a mirage created by the desert. Even for the Navajos, they were spirit mountains. As Langford and his horse Wolf crossed the splintered desert floor, they entered an area of sand. Silvermane, Langford's other horse, slowed his trot, and his hoofs sank deep into the sand. Langford dismounted and walked beside Wolf, feeling the heat burning the soles of his feet. He stopped once to tie another moccasin on Wolf's worn paw, this time the left one. He also pulled the stopper from the water bag and cooled his parched lips and throat. The waves of the sand dunes were like those of the ocean. Langford did not look back, dreading to see how little progress he had made. Ahead of him were miles of graceful heaps, swelling mounds, and crested ridges, all different yet regular and rhythmical. They were like endless waves of dune on dune. Wisps of sand were whipped from their summits in white ribbons and wreaths, and pale clouds of sand shrouded little hollows. The morning breeze, rising out of the west, approached in rippling lines like the crest of an inflowing tide. Suddenly Silvermane snorted, lifted his ears, and looked westward toward a yellow pall that swooped up from the desert. "Sandstorm," said Langford, and calling Wolf, he made for the nearest rock that was large enough to shelter them. The whirling sand cloud mushroomed into an enormous desert covering, engulfing the dunes and obscuring the light. The sunlight failed, and the day turned to gloom. Then an eddying fog of sand and dust enveloped Langford. His last glimpse before he covered his face with a silk handkerchief was of sheets of sand streaming past his shelter. The storm came with a low, soft, hissing roar like the sound in a seashell magnified. Langford covered his face with a handkerchief to protect himself from the sandstorm. The sand was relentless, and even with the handkerchief he felt the dust particles creeping in and suffocating him. He coughed and gasped for breath, fearing that he would not make it out alive. But he persevered, waiting patiently for the storm to pass. The weight of the sand was heavy on his hat and shoulders, and his feet were trapped in the sandy ground. Finally the storm subsided, and Langford removed the handkerchief to see the extent of the damage. He was buried nearly to his knees in sand, and his horse, Silvermane, was also burdened with it. Langford knew that these sandstorms were just a part of life in the desert, but he couldn't help feeling frustrated and exhausted. "How many more of these storms will we have to endure, Wolf?" he asked his horse, trying to maintain a positive attitude. As he continued on his journey, Langford was forced to seek shelter from another sandstorm. He waited patiently, knowing that it was his only option. When the storm passed, he was caught in the open with no shelter in sight. He turned his back to the next storm, bracing himself for the impact of the sand. Langford trudged wearily beside Silvermane, unsure of how much farther he had to go. The distance seemed endless, and he couldn't even judge how far he had traveled. Eventually he climbed back into the saddle, relieved to have clear air again. In the distance he could see the black spur looming up once more, surrounded by mesas with green-tinted slopes. Langford knew that he still had a long way to go, but he was determined to make it to his destination. The end of the long trail was in sight, as the spots of green in the distance hinted at a waterhole in the desert. Langford's hopes were renewed as he pressed on through the barren rock plain, scattered with enormous boulders. Finally he reached a level floor of meager sage and greasewood, where only a few desert creatures, such as hawks, lizards, and ground birds, could be seen. It was a wasteland, devoid of life. He then entered a zone of clay dunes painted with violet and heliotrope hues, followed by a belt of lava and cactus. The reddish points scattered throughout the desert were patches of white grass, while far away countless cactus plants resembled a troop of distorted horsemen. As he advanced, the grass disappeared, and jagged lava streams flowed downward. He had to dismount to make moccasins for Wolf's hind feet and lead Silvermane carefully over the cracked lava. For a while there were strips of ground without lava, but soon every step was covered in fierce spikes and thorns. The huge barrel-shaped cacti, thickets of slender dark green rods with bayonet points, and broad leaves with yellow spines made Langford and his aching companions seek refuge on the lava. Langford hoped the end of the inferno was near, but it seemed like it would never end. He was blistered by the heat, pierced by the thorns, and exhausted from the long journey. Finally, he stepped out onto the bare desert, where he pitched camp and discovered that the water bag had leaked or the water had evaporated, leaving only enough for one more day. As Langford tended to his parched animals, he couldn't help but dwell on the harsh reality of his situation. The meager fire he had managed to start barely illuminated the surrounding darkness. Not even a single sound broke the eerie silence. Langford longed for even the howl of a coyote. His horse, Silvermane, stood motionless with exhaustion, while his dog, Wolf, lay limply on the sand. Langford himself rolled into his blanket, grateful for any relief from the aches and pains that racked his body. As he drifted off to sleep, Langford found himself dreaming of his youth, running and playing on the green hills of his family's farm. He remembered wading through dewy clover fields and fishing in the Connecticut River. It was a time of endless freedom, of long summer days spent swimming with his friends. But even in his dreams, Langford couldn't escape the harsh reality of his situation. When he finally awoke, the sun was already high in the sky, casting a fiery glow over the desert landscape. Langford knew he would need to conserve his water carefully, as the blazing sun would quickly evaporate any that was spilled or leaked. In the end, he decided to share what he had with his loyal companions, giving them each a fair share before continuing on his journey. As the hours passed, Langford trudged through the barren landscape, his tired animals struggling to keep up. The heat was oppressive, and the air shimmered with the waves of heat rising from the desert floor. Langford's reality was a far cry from the idyllic days of his youth, with nothing but endless stretches of baked clay flats, dusty alkali beds, and treacherous gullies filled with jagged rocks. Despite the hardships, Langford was determined to press on. He knew that his only chance of survival lay in reaching civilization before his water supply ran out. And so he pushed forward, his faithful dog by his side, until the haunting presence of the desert began to fade away. Langford was surrounded by the desert's illusions. The water in the low places shimmered, and the mountains in the distance seemed to float in the air. The green slopes rose up close to him, and the buttes of dark blue stood out against the open sand like giant ships at sea. The changing shapes of the desert landscape, covered in pink haze and veils of purple and white luster, were all tricks of the mirage. In the scorching heat of midday, Langford gave in to the mirage's influence and stopped his horse under a slate bank for some shade. His face was swollen and peeling from the harsh sun, and his lips were dry and cracked, tasting of alkali. Wolf and Silvermane continued on while Langford dozed in the saddle, grateful to escape the barren landscape. As the afternoon wore on, Silvermane stumbled, jolting Langford out of his stupor. Before him was a vast field of boulders with no sign of a slope, ridge, mesa, or escarpment. Langford rubbed his sore eyes, wondering if this was another illusion. When Silvermane started forward again, Langford relied on the desert-bred instincts of his horse and dog beyond human understanding in their sight and scent. Resigned to his fate, Langford found a certain calmness in his soul, as cold as the touch of an icy hand on a fevered cheek. He remembered the desert secret in Mescal's eyes and was determined to solve it. He also recalled August Justice's words, "It's a man's deed." Langford had achieved the spirit of it, if not the letter. As he thought back, he recalled Eshtah's words about the vast wilderness of painted wastelands. "There's where the Navajo is buried, and nobody knows how to get to his resting place." The feeling of something greater than himself, always just out of reach, came flooding back to him. Now it was manifested in the unforgiving grasp of the desert. It had beckoned him with danger and beauty, and its mystifying call was finally answered. He had entered willingly, but once inside, the desert had sealed its doors behind him. Now he gazed upon it with a sense of awe and dread, its ancient structures crumbling under the weight of time and destruction. The desert was an unforgiving force, unyielding in its pursuit of balance and order. Chapter 15. The gray stallion noticed the loose rein and trotted ahead to catch up with the dog, following closely behind. As the sun set, a cool breeze swept through and cleared the hot air. The darkness of the desert enveloped the land as night fell, although it initially eased Langford's sun-damaged eyes to have the endless horizon disappear. The blackness soon reminded him of his isolation. He was completely alone in this vast wasteland, with only his animal companions to keep him company. Wolf led the way in silence while Silvermane remained close behind, never faltering and sure-footed even in the darkness. Langford's love for the horse grew even stronger on this night in the desert. Wolf and Silvermane continued on, weaving in and out of the sandy lanes between boulders, their footsteps silent. They traveled for miles and miles, free to choose their path. As the eastern sky began to brighten, the moon rose and illuminated the black boulders on the horizon. The moon rose above the horizon, a strange orange-colored oval that Langford had never seen before. Unlike the usual mellow and silvery moon, this one was a melancholy orb that reminded him of the lifelessness of the desert. Langford rode on Silvermane, his trusty horse, but soon the animal went lame, causing him to dismount. Upon inspection, Langford found a stone embedded in Silvermane's cloven hoof and carefully removed it with his knife. As they continued their journey, Wolf, Langford's dog, ran ahead and let out a mournful howl that sent shivers down Langford's spine. The silence around them was oppressive and eerie, as if there was no sign of life in the area. Langford made sure not to fall behind Wolf again, not wanting to hear that chilling cry once more. The dog moved silently while the horse's hooves made a soft padding sound on the sand. The night wore on, and Langford grew increasingly tired. His body ached for rest, but he knew they had to keep moving. He dozed off several times, nearly falling off Silvermane until the morning star rose in the east, signaling the arrival of a new day. Langford stopped at a wind-worn cave under a rock and fell asleep on the sand-strewn floor. He woke up once, but the heat and glare of the sun made him quickly shut his eyes again. He slept until Wolf woke him up with a cold nose and a low whine. Another twilight had fallen upon them. Langford emerged from the unforgiving desert, aching and famished, his throat dry and his mind spinning. He tried to eat, but the food only exacerbated his symptoms. Wolf and Silvermane, his faithful companions, refused their own meals, opting instead for a few blades of grass. With no other options, they set out into the night. The darkness enveloped them, but a refreshing breeze from the west carried them forward. The stars twinkled above, and the moon cast an eerie light upon the grotesque boulders that loomed before them. Langford's mind conjured up images of these rocks as tombs, pillars, and even statues of long-forgotten creatures. His imagination ran wild, and he fought to keep his spirits up. Wolf, however, was a real presence, and he led them toward water, the key to their survival. Silvermane, a creature of the desert, was unyielding in his determination to see them through. Langford summoned every ounce of his energy to keep up, but the silence of the desert was deafening, and he felt as though the weight of the ages bore down upon him. As they rode on, Langford's mind became increasingly muddled. The moon, worn and tired like the desert itself, shone down upon them as they rode through the desolate landscape. The shadows seemed to hold lurking dangers, and Langford fought to keep his grip on reality. Finally they stumbled upon water, and Langford collapsed in exhaustion. His mind was numb, and his tongue felt thick in his mouth. Silvermane, invigorated by the discovery of water, led them onward, and Langford clung to the saddle, grateful to be alive. Silvermane descended the rocky terrain with a metallic clink step by step. Whether he went up or down was of no concern to Langford. He held on tight with his eyes shut and whispered to himself. The gray stallion carefully made his way down, cracking the stones with his iron hooves, sure-footed as a mountain goat. Finally he stopped with a great heave and lowered his head. The black bulge of a canyon rim appeared blurry in Langford's hot eyes. A trickling sound penetrated his tired brain. His ears had become as false as his eyes. Only another illusion. Just as he was tormented with the sight of lake and stream before, he was now tormented with the sound of running water. Yet he listened, for it was sweet even in its mockery. What a clear musical tinkle, like silver bells tossing on the wind. He listened, soft murmuring flow, babble and gurgle, little hollow fall and splash. Suddenly Silvermane lifted his head and broke the canyon's silence with a great sigh of content. It pierced the dull fantasy of Langford's mind and broke the gloomy spell. The sigh and snort which followed were Silvermane's triumphant signals when he had drunk his fill. Langford fell from the saddle, and the gray dog lay stretched low in the darkness. Langford crawled beside him and reached out with his hot hands. Smooth, cool marble rock, growing slippery, then wet, led into running water. He slid forward on his face, and wonderful cold thrills quivered over his burning skin. He drank and drank until he could drink no more. Then he lay back upon the rock, the madness of his brain going out with the light of the stars, and he slept. When he awoke, the red canyon walls leaned far above him to a gap spanned by blue sky, and a song of rushing water murmured near his ears. Looking down, Langford saw a spring gushing from a crack in the wall. Silvermane was busy cropping green bushes, while Wolf sat on his haunches, waiting patiently. However, the sadness and strange look in Wolf's eyes were gone. Langford raised himself, taking in the surrounding scenery and slowly regaining his senses. The crimson blur had disappeared from his eyes, the burning from his skin, and the painful swelling from his tongue. He drank deeply from the spring and rose with a thankful heart, kissing Wolf's white head and wrapping his arms around Silvermane's neck. He fed them and ate himself, though it was difficult due to his swollen lips and tongue feeling like a piece of rope. His strength returned after he ate. With a word, Wolf wagged his tail and splashed into the gravelly stream bed. Langford followed on foot, leading Silvermane. The canyon was narrow and winding, with red cliffs growing higher as he descended, blocking his view. The blue sky above became bluer as the light and shade diminished. Langford went down steadily without a pause for an hour, and the way became rougher as he went farther down. Boulders wedged in narrow places made foaming waterfalls. Silvermane moved confidently as the slender stream of water, swelled by seeping springs and little rills, gained the dignity of a brook and began to dash merrily and hurriedly downward. The falls grew deeper, the cliffs higher, and the boulders larger as they descended. Wolf splashed on, showing a new spirit in his movements. When he looked back for his companions, there was friendly protest in his eyes. Silvermane's mien showed that where a dog could go, he could follow. The blood of Silvermane, Langford's trusted horse, was pumping with excitement. The desert was a familiar terrain to him, but this canyon with its steep drops and narrow passages was a new challenge that he was eager to conquer. Years of living in the wild had given him an unparalleled sense of balance and sure-footedness. As they descended deeper into the canyon, the walls closed in around them, blocking out the sunlight. Langford had to crane his neck to catch a glimpse of the blue sky above. "If we ever make it out of here, climbing up will be a breeze," he wheezed, trying to catch his breath. The trail had disappeared, replaced by slick, bare rock. The brook they had been following now cascaded down mossy cliffs, leaving them no choice but to scramble over jagged ledges. Langford was about to give up hope when they reached a spot where the canyon floor dropped off into a dark abyss. On the right, a narrow shelf of rock jutted out from the wall, barely wide enough to walk on. Langford hesitated, unsure if he could make it across without falling to his death. But Wolf, his loyal dog, trotted confidently onto the ledge, followed by Silvermane. Langford had no choice but to follow, gripping the rocky wall for support as he gingerly made his way across. He held his breath, waiting for the sound of hooves slipping on the slick rock, but Silvermane's steps were steady and sure. Finally, they reached the other side, panting with relief. Langford couldn't help but feel grateful for his animal companions who had led him safely through this treacherous terrain. He focused all his attention on the narrow ledge with the blue abyss below him. Finally, Langford made it to level rock, relieved to see Silvermane rounding the corner of the dark passage and joining him. Langford shouted out in welcome. The canyon began to widen, and the red walls gave way to yellow. The brook had no exit from its subterranean channel. Langford's exhaustion almost made him forget his mission as he kept going, feeling only the pain of his bruised hands and feet and the ache of his lungs. The sun hung in the middle of the broadening belt of blue sky as time passed. A long yellow slope led down to a sage-covered level where Langford was pleased to see blooming cacti with slender, lofty green stems shining with gold flowers. He descended into a ravine that became precipitous, slowing his progress. At the bottom he found himself in a wonderful lane with a nearly level floor where a shallow stream flowed bordered by green willows. Wolf followed the direction of the flowing water. Langford's thoughts were all about mescal, and his hopes began to rise, his heart pounding. He strained his eyes ahead, but there was not a break in the walls. A drowsy hum of falling water reached Langford, a strange reminder of the oasis, the dull roar of the Colorado and of mescal. His flagging energy leaped into life as the canyon suddenly opened up to bright light and blue sky, revealing a beautiful valley white and gold in blossom, green with grass and cottonwood. On a flower-scented wind rushed that muffled roar again like distant thunder. Wolf dashed into the cottonwoods, and Silvermane whistled with satisfaction, reaching for the long grass. The beauty of the light and the sweet scent of water and blossom held something more than just aesthetic value for Langford. They were charged with meaning and suspense. Suddenly Wolf emerged from the open, leaping upon a slender figure dressed in brown garments. "Mescal!" Langford cried out in shock. Without hesitation, Mescal ran towards him with her arms outstretched, her hair flying in the wind, and her dark eyes filled with joy. Chapter 16. Langford's mind briefly went blank as Mescal's incoherent murmurs failed to register. However, he quickly regained his composure and held on to the girl tightly, unwilling to let her go. Mescal clung to him with a wildness that made him worry for her sanity. Her arms were tense, and she blindly groped for his face. "Mescal, it's Jack, safe and sound," he reassured her. "Let me take a good look at you." At the sound of Langford's voice, Mescal's rigid strength gave way to weakness. She leaned back, supported by his arms, and gazed at him. Langford was overwhelmed by the level gaze he remembered so well, and tears streamed down his face as he brought her head to his shoulder. He had not prepared himself for this new Mescal. Despite her quivering smile of happiness, her eyes were pained. Her face, once oval and radiant, had lost its former glow. She was still beautiful, but it was a mere shadow of her former self. "Jack, is it really you?" she asked. He answered her with a kiss. She pulled away, breathless and blushing.